I've made very clear on this show that I question those in the left-leaning media who keep telling us the legal walls are closing in on Donald Trump. That the Justice Department, in its probe of the events leading up to January 6th, are targeting or close to indicting the former president. I fear it's often more liberal advocacy than sober legal analysis. But there are developments from the past 24 hours that have to lead anyone to ask the question again. A federal grand jury has now subpoenaed former White House counsel Pat Cipollone and former Deputy White House counsel Patrick Philbin, which means the investigation is now getting close to the president. And while the president's inner circle is not the president himself, I will admit that I paused when I heard two smart legal analysts say this.
Now it's 100% clear that this is an investigation inside the Oval Office of Donald Trump.
But you don't call in the White House counsel, the Deputy White House counsel, particularly in the wake of the testimony they gave to the 1-6 committee, unless you're looking squarely and directly at Donald Trump.
But I thought about this for a while, and I don't believe that to be true. I think the White House counsel would inevitably be called in connection with a federal investigation, for example, into the so-called fake elector scheme, or even beyond. Cipollone had a front row seat, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're looking squarely at Donald Trump. Now remember, Cipollone's name came up a lot during the January 6th committee hearings. As White House counsel, he resisted attempts to overturn the 2020 election results. But he also has said that Trump truly believed the election was stolen, which would be very helpful legally to the former president. And then more fodder for the media who wants to suggest it's imminent, as we learn that Trump's legal team is apparently in direct contact with the DOJ about issues from executive privilege that could shield what witnesses in Trump's inner circle can or can't say to the grand jury. But again, that should come as a surprise to no one. I still believe many in the media have been hoping for an indictment more than analyzing what we know and what it means. Like this Rolling Stone scoop from earlier this week headlined, "Trump's lawyers are preparing legal defenses against criminal charges." Quote, "According to internal communications reviewed by Rolling Stone, Trump's team is quietly planning for criminal charges as they wait for the Justice Department to make its move." Well, of course they're preparing for the possibility, as any competent attorney would. It's their job to be ready for anything. But buried in that article, they talk about the fact that Trump's lawyers believe it's unlikely to happen. Now, things really got hot in the left-leaning media when last week the Washington Post reported that, quote, "Justice Department investigating Trump's actions in January 6th criminal probe." People familiar with the probe said investigators are examining the former president's conversations and have seized phone records of top aides. As I said, when that headline came out, confident the reporting's true. Even before the Cipollone and Philbin subpoenas came to light, top aides to the former vice president, including his former chief of staff, had been testifying before a federal grand jury in recent weeks as part of that federal investigation. And I am guessing that there will be indictments in connection with that fake electors scheme, where some Trump allies tried to put forward lists of people falsely claiming to be electoral college electors in battleground states that went to Biden. But just because questions are being asked about Trump does not mean that he is a target or that he is going to be indicted. Yes, if you are Donald Trump's lawyers and Donald Trump himself, these new subpoenas of the White House counsel and his top aide should make you nervous. But no, I still do not see any strong indication that the former president is the target of the investigation or close to being indicted. Joining me now is former federal prosecutor Renato Mariotti, who shared my skepticism about the media coverage before this latest revelation. Renato, welcome back to the show. So has this changed your view a bit?
It definitely does. I spend a lot of time, Dan, now that I'm in private practice, reading the tea leaves about government investigations and trying to predict for my clients what little signals mean. And this is, I think, a significant one. I don't think any of my clients, if I told them their former attorney is been subpoenaed and is being questioned about conversations that related to actions you took or others around you, I think they'd be concerned. And I think this just is another sign that there should be concern in the Trump camp that at least some of the actions of those near him are being.
Wait. But there's a lot of words there, right? Which is, I agree with you that some near him, right? Yes. But my question is, does this add anything to the speculation, and I read tea leaves too, does this add anything to the speculation that Donald Trump is the target of or may soon be indicted? I mean, it just seems to me inevitable after Pat Cipollone testified in front of the January 6th Commission that they would want to ask him questions about the fake elector scheme and beyond. And I'm not sure that I agree with Preet Bharara, Jeffrey Toobin, and many others who are suggesting, well, this means that they're looking squarely at Donald Trump. I don't know that that necessarily does mean that.
Well, I don't want to split hairs here. I mean, what I would say, and I think you may be doing that.
I may be.
You may be, because I think that, look, this fake elector scheme, as you point out, it's a criminal investigation. You think there's likely to be charges. Donald Trump was involved in that. Now, whether his involvement was criminal, whether he joined in the criminal portion of it, we don't know. But if I was Donald Trump's attorney and he told me the feds are looking at this scheme I was involved in and they're talking to my attorney and others who were involved in it, I would be very concerned. And I would tell him, you should assume you're under criminal investigation. Now, does that mean he's going to be the target or be indicted? No, but when the feds are looking at your actions and talking to your attorney, it's a cause for great concern.
Renato, you would correct someone who would call the White House counsel the personal attorney of the president, right? It's not his attorney. He's the White House counsel, but he's not his private lawyer, right? There is an obligation that he has beyond just to that person, and that's why it's different, I think, than some of the scenarios you're laying out.
Well, that may be. I actually think it's more dangerous for the former president because I think he sought the advice of Mr. Cipollone and maybe had candid conversations with him, but the protection of attorney-client privilege with Mr. Cipollone is lower, and the D.C. Circuit has held it can be overcome by a DOJ subpoena. So actually, if he had hired somebody like me or you, a private attorney, then he would have more protection. So I don't know. I do think there's a lot for Trump to be concerned about. Whether that's an indictment or not, I don't know, but I definitely think he should be concerned.
Yeah, and again, I hear you. I understand why this is considered a sort of big development, but I do think it's overstated to say this means that they are looking at Donald Trump. We don't know that they're looking at Donald Trump as a possible. We just don't.
Yeah, I think we know that they're looking at his actions. We know that they're talking to people, his close aides and confidants.
Okay.
That's what we know, and I think that's precise to say. That said, I don't know if that would give any of my clients comfort if I split those hairs with them.
Yeah, but again, there's a huge difference between talking to people and asking them about what did he do and what I am hearing from many in the media, which is the suggestion that, oh boy, here we go. Things are going. Donald Trump may soon be indicted. And look, I may end up being totally wrong. As you point out, we're reading tea leaves here. I feel like, in many ways I'm in the minority now on this. But I still do not believe that there are any strong indications that Donald Trump is the target or that he's about to be indicted. Final word.
If I was a betting man, I wouldn't put a lot of money on that either. I agree with you.
Oh,
that
all right. So wait, we agree. All right.
It's not any. I wouldn't say it's very likely he's going to be indicted, but definitely some concerning things.
All right, concern. Yeah, a little sweat here and there. I understand, but that's different than being the target or being indicted. Thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find NewsNation on your cable provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.